License and registration, please.
Yes, officer, here you go.
Do you know why I pulled you over?
No, officer.
Sir, you can't stop here.
Officer, this is official military business.
I need to see some ID.
Blue lights cut through the Georgia darkness like a warning nobody asked for. The silver Nissan Altima rolled to a stop on the shoulder of Old Ridgewood Highway, gravel crunching beneath its tires. Inside, a man in a navy dress uniform checked his rearview mirror. His ribbons caught the glow of the patrol car's headlights. His bronze star gleamed against the dark fabric. The golden trident pinned above his heart marked him as one of the most elite warriors America had ever produced. None of it would matter in the next 90 seconds. Sergeant Wade Crenshaw stepped out of his cruiser with his hand already resting on his holstered weapon. He hadn't run the plates. He hadn't observed a traffic violation. He had seen exactly one thing that mattered to him: the color of the driver's skin. In 11 months, this officer would lose his badge, his pension, and his freedom. The city of Ridgewood would cut a check for $1.2 million, and the man about to bleed on this asphalt had survived firefights in Fallujah, ambushes in Kandahar, and classified missions in places the American public would never know existed. He had walked through hell for 16 years without a scratch from enemy fire. Tonight, the enemy wore an American badge. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Crenshaw's voice was flat, rehearsed, a command he had given 100 times before to men who looked exactly like this one. His body camera recorded everything. His dashcam captured the angles. He wasn't worried. He had never been worried. Footage had a way of disappearing in Ridgewood. The driver's door opened slowly, and Chief Petty Officer Kendrick Davenport placed both hands where they could be seen and rose to his full height. 6'2", 215 pounds of muscle built in combat, not in a gym. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was perfect. His voice was calm. "Good evening, officer. I'm a Navy SEAL returning from deployment. My military identification is in my left breast pocket. I'm happy to retrieve it slowly if you'll allow me. If this satisfies your curiosity and appetite for justice-driven stories, that satisfying bell and subscribe button is waiting. Tap it now. Future stories like this one land for subscribers first. If you choose not to subscribe, drop a comment and tell us why. We genuinely want to know." Crenshaw didn't move. His eyes traveled from Kendrick's face to his uniform to the trident insignia and back again. Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, not respect. Something uglier. "Where'd you get that uniform?" The question hung in the humid October air. Kendrick felt his jaw tighten, but kept his hands visible and his tone even. He had been trained to remain calm under pressure that would break most men. Insurgents had pointed rifles at his chest. Warlords had threatened his life. He had held dying brothers in his arms and kept his voice steady enough to call in medevacs. He could handle a traffic stop. "I earned it, sir. 16 years of service. I have documentation for everything I'm wearing. If you contact Naval Special Warfare Command, they can verify my identity immediately." Crenshaw's lip curled. "Yeah, sure you did." He keyed his radio without breaking eye contact. "Dispatch, I've got a black male on Old Ridgewood Highway wearing what appears to be a stolen military uniform, possible impersonation of a federal officer, requesting backup." Kendrick's heart rate stayed steady. His breathing remained controlled. But a cold realization began settling into his bones. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an officer being cautious. This was something else entirely. He had seen this look before, in the eyes of men who had already decided what you were before you ever opened your mouth. "Sir, I am not impersonating anyone. I am Chief Petty Officer Kendrick Davenport, United States Navy. My service number is—" "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. I haven't committed any crime. I'm requesting that you contact my command to verify—" "I said turn around." Kendrick turned. He placed his palms flat against the warm metal of the rental car, his medals pressed into his chest, his shoulder blades tensed. Behind him, he heard Crenshaw's boots scraping the pavement, heard the creak of a duty belt, heard the sharp intake of breath that came before violence. What Crenshaw didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Kendrick was still wearing his combat chest camera, standard equipment for operators returning from deployment. The device was small, matte black, nearly invisible against his uniform. It had recorded firefights in Syria. It had captured missions in Afghanistan. And now, It was recording every word, every movement, every decision Wade Crenshaw made. The first blow came without warning. Crenshaw's forearm slammed into the back of Kendrick's neck, driving his face toward the roof of the car. Kendrick's training screamed at him to react, to counter, to neutralize. His body knew 17 different ways to incapacitate an attacker from this position. His hands knew how to turn aggression into submission in under 3 seconds. But his mind knew something more important. He knew how this ended for black men who fought back against police officers. He knew what the headlines would say. He knew what the jury would believe. So he didn't resist. He let his body go limp as Crenshaw wrenched his arm behind his back. He felt his shoulder separate from the socket with a wet, grinding pop that sent lightning through his entire left side. He tasted blood where his lip had split against the car's frame, and he heard the words Crenshaw whispered into his ear. Words the sergeant didn't realize were being recorded. Words that would eventually play in a federal courtroom. Words so ugly they would make a jury of 12 strangers gasp out loud. As Kendrick's face pressed into the asphalt, as the blue lights painted the scene in rotating judgment, he made a decision. He wouldn't fight back with his fists. He wouldn't give them the narrative they wanted. He had been trained to dismantle enemies far more dangerous than Wade Crenshaw, and he knew exactly how to do it. Moselle Davenport had hands like geography. Every line a road she had traveled, every callus a mountain she had climbed. At 74 years old, those hands had scrubbed office floors at midnight, stirred pots of gumbo at noon, and pressed steam irons against rich folks' shirts until her fingerprints nearly disappeared. She had raised a grandson on 3 jobs and 4 hours of sleep. She had buried her only daughter and watched her daughter's boyfriend disappear behind prison walls before the funeral flowers wilted. But she had never buried the boy. Kendrick Lamar Davenport came into the world on August 17, 1986, in the same 9th Ward shotgun house where his mother took her last breath. Childbirth complications, the doctors said. Nothing anyone could have done, the doctors said. Moselle stopped listening to what doctors said after that. She wrapped her grandson in a blanket her own mother had crocheted and carried him home through streets where gunshots punctuated the night like commas in a long run-on sentence of poverty. The 9th Ward didn't forgive weakness. It didn't wait for children to grow up. It either made you hard or it buried you soft. And Moselle decided from that first night that her grandson would be neither. "This world gonna try to tell you what you are," she whispered to the sleeping infant. "You show him what you decided to be." Kendrick grew up fast because the 9th Ward didn't offer any other option. By 8, he knew which corners belonged to which crews. By 10, he could read a room for threat assessment before he could read a chapter book without stumbling. By 12, he had witnessed 2 drive-by shootings on his own block. One of them killed his neighbor, Miss Lorraine, while she was watering her garden. The other one took something even worse. Tavion Boudreau was 11 years old when he got shot over a pair of sneakers. What in Nike Air Jordans, the bread colorway, brand new from a church donation drive. Some 15-year-old from 3 blocks over decided he wanted them. Tavion said no. 30 seconds later, Tavion was lying in the street with a hole in his chest and a look of surprise still frozen on his face. Kendrick was the one who held his hand while they waited for an ambulance that took 19 minutes to arrive. He was the one who watched the light leave his best friend's eyes. He was the one who had to tell Tavion's mother what happened, because the adults were too shattered to form sentences. That night, Kendrick sat on Moselle's porch and didn't cry. His grandmother brought him a glass of sweet tea and lowered herself into the rocking chair beside him. They sat in silence for almost an hour before she spoke. "What you thinking about? A baby?" Kendrick stared at the street where his friend had died. "I'm thinking I want to protect people, Grandma, not destroy them." Moselle nodded slowly. "Then you better become something strong enough to do it." 6 years later, Kendrick Davenport walked into a Navy recruiting office with nothing but a high school diploma and his grandmother's blessing. The recruiter looked at his test scores and asked if he'd ever considered special operations. Kendrick didn't know what that meant, but he said yes anyway. He had learned early that opportunity didn't knock twice in the 9th Ward. BUD/S training nearly killed him. The basic underwater demolition course was designed to break men, to strip away everything soft, and see what remained underneath. Candidates arrived in classes of over 200. Usually fewer than 30 graduated. And the instructors didn't care about your background, your reasons, or your dreams. They cared about one thing: Could you refuse to quit when your body and mind were both screaming at you to stop? During Hell Week, 5.5 days of continuous training on fewer than 4 total hours of sleep, Kendrick fractured his tibia during a night ocean swim. The bone cracked against a submerged rock and sent fire through his entire leg. Most candidates would have reported the injury. Most candidates would have been medically rolled to a future class. Kendrick wrapped his leg in an elastic bandage and told no one. For 2 weeks he ran on a fractured bone. He carried logs and boats on a fractured bone. He did flutter kicks in the freezing surf on a fractured bone. When a corpsman finally discovered the injury during a routine check, he demanded to know how Kendrick was still standing. Kendrick just shrugged. My grandmother worked 3 jobs on worse than this. He graduated BUD/S at 21. By 23, he had earned the Trident and joined the ranks of the most elite special operators in American military history. By 25, he had completed his first 3 combat deployments. By 30, he had lost count of the missions that would never appear in any official record. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, places with names that appeared in newspapers and places with names that never would. Kendrick learned how to move through darkness like he belonged to it. He learned how to enter a room and neutralize every threat before the occupants could reach for their weapons. He learned how to make split-second decisions that determined whether American soldiers came home alive or draped in flags. The Bronze Star came after a mission in Helmand Province. His team was ambushed during an extraction. 2 Marines were hit and bleeding out in a burning vehicle, while enemy rounds tore the air above their heads. Kendrick crossed 60 meters of open ground with no cover, pulled both Marines from the wreckage, and carried them to safety one at a time. A round grazed his neck. Shrapnel caught his left thigh. He kept moving. The Purple Hearts came from wounds he didn't discuss. The scars on his body mapped a history of sacrifice that would horrify most civilians. But the wounds that hurt the most weren't the ones that left marks on his skin. They were the faces of teammates who didn't make it home. They were the promises he made to dying men in languages their families would never hear. He had held Petty Officer Second Class Jerome Satterfield in his arms during a nighttime raid gone wrong. Jerome was 26 years old, from Mobile, Alabama, with a fiancée who was 5 months pregnant. The bullet had caught him below his vest. There was nothing anyone could do except stay with him until it was over. "Tell her I loved her," Jerome whispered. "Tell her I would have been a good dad." "You tell her yourself," Kendrick said. "We're getting you out of here." They both knew it was a lie, but it was the right lie. It was the lie that let Jerome close his eyes without fear. Kendrick delivered that message in person 2 weeks later. He held Jerome's fiancée while she sobbed and felt something inside himself turn to stone. That was the price of this job. You became hard enough to survive it, and then you spent the rest of your life wondering if you would ever feel soft again. 16 years, 11 deployments, 37 teammates dead, countless lives saved. Chief Petty Officer Kendrick Davenport had given everything a man could give to his country. He submitted his retirement paperwork on September 29th. He was done. He had bought a house in Ridgewood, Georgia, close enough to Atlanta for good medical care and quiet enough for Moselle to spend her remaining years in peace. His grandmother's dementia was getting worse. Some days she recognized him. Some days she called him by his father's name. Either way, he was going to be there. He owed her that much. He owed her everything. 16 days after filing that paperwork, young Kendrick Davenport would be face down on an American highway, bleeding from his face, his shoulder dislocated, his decorated uniform pressed into the asphalt by a man who saw nothing but a threat to be neutralized. He had survived 11 deployments without a scratch from enemy fire. But America had one more battle waiting for him. The photograph hung in the front hallway of the Crenshaw family home like a declaration of values. Black and white, slightly faded, preserved behind glass that Norma Crenshaw polished every Sunday after church. In it, a young man in a deputy's uniform stood beside a wooden sign with bold letters painted across its face. The sign read, "Whites Only." The deputy was smiling. That deputy was Wade Crenshaw's grandfather. His name was Buford Crenshaw, and he had served as sheriff of Ridgewood County from 1954 to 1971, years when the badge meant something different than it did today. Years when certain people stayed in certain neighborhoods and everybody understood the rules. Years when a man like Buford could do whatever was necessary to maintain order, and never once face a question from the people who mattered. Wade grew up hearing stories about Grandpa Buford like other children heard fairy tales. How he kept the peace, how he commanded respect, how he made sure the community stayed safe for the families who deserved to be safe. The language was always careful, always coded, but Wade understood what the words really meant long before anyone had to explain it directly. His father, Earl Crenshaw, carried the legacy into the next generation. 30 years on the Ridgewood police force, retiring as a lieutenant with a full pension and a reputation that depended on who you asked. In certain neighborhoods, Earl Crenshaw was remembered as professional, helpful, a steady presence during emergencies. In other neighborhoods with different demographics, the name Crenshaw was spoken the way you might speak about a natural disaster. Something you survived if you were lucky, something you didn't if you weren't. Wade joined the force at 22. He didn't consider any other career. This was his inheritance, his birthright, the family business passed down through blood. His grandfather's photograph hung in his own living room now, positioned where he could see it from his recliner. He looked at it often. He drew strength from it. By 43, Sergeant Wade Crenshaw had accumulated a personnel file that should have ended his career a dozen times over. 17 formal complaints of excessive force. 12 of them involved black men. 4 dashcam recordings captured him using racial slurs during traffic stops. The footage showed his mouth forming the words clearly, unmistakably, the kind of evidence that would have destroyed any other officer's future. Every single recording was marked as corrupted before Internal Affairs could review it. The pattern was consistent enough to map. Terrell Givens, 2019, 22 years old, stopped for a broken taillight, ended up with a fractured orbital bone and 3 loose teeth. Terrell filed a complaint. Internal Affairs investigated for 2 weeks, found insufficient evidence of wrongdoing, and closed the case. The city's insurance paid a small settlement with no admission of liability. Terrell moved out of state 6 months later. Dante Blackwood, 2020, 31 years old, a middle school basketball coach, stopped for allegedly rolling through a stop sign. The dashcam showed he made a complete stop. That footage corrupted too. Dante ended up face down on the hood of his own car with Crenshaw's knee in his back, while his 10-year-old son watched from the passenger seat. The complaint went nowhere. Dante's son stopped playing basketball that year. Alvin Cartwright, 2021, 45 years old, a deacon at Mount Zion Baptist Church, stopped for matching the description of a suspect while driving home from Wednesday night Bible study. The suspect was described as a black male in his 20s, wearing a red hoodie. Alvin was middle-aged, wearing a gray suit, driving a Buick. Crenshaw held him at gunpoint for 11 minutes before backup arrived and pointed out the obvious discrepancy. No footage survived. No discipline followed. 3 victims, 3 years. The same officer, the same department, the same outcome. But Terrell Givens didn't have a network that reached the Pentagon. Dante Blackwood didn't have former teammates serving as military attorneys. Alvin Cartwright didn't have a combat camera recording everything. Kendrick Davenport did. The Internal Affairs file on Wade Crenshaw told a story of institutional failure so complete it almost seemed intentional. Supervisors had noted concerns about his aggressive approach to community policing. Training officers had recommended additional de-escalation courses. A department psychologist had flagged concerning patterns in subject interactions during a routine evaluation. None of it mattered. Every concern was noted and filed. Every flag was raised and ignored. Every opportunity to stop what was coming was documented and dismissed. The system didn't fail because no one noticed. The system failed because noticing wasn't enough. The system required consequences, and consequences required someone with the power to demand them. For years, no one with that power had crossed Wade Crenshaw's path. We've all seen cases like this play out the same way. Complaints filed, settlements paid, officers transferred. Nothing changes. If you want to see how this one finally broke different, subscribe now. What happens next involves the Pentagon, the FBI, and a federal courtroom. This is the story you'll want to finish. The night of October 14th, Wade Crenshaw was running radar on Old Ridgewood Highway when a silver Nissan Altima passed his position heading northbound. The vehicle was traveling exactly 4 miles below the posted speed limit, Both headlights were functioning. Both taillights were functioning. The registration was current, the inspection sticker was valid, and the driver had committed no traffic violation of any kind. Crenshaw pulled out anyway. He would later claim he observed erratic lane position and suspicious behavior, language that appeared in his reports so often it had become a template. The bodycam footage would show the Altima maintaining its lane perfectly. The dashcam footage would show a vehicle driving exactly the way driving instructors teach their students to drive. But Wade Crenshaw had seen the driver's face in his headlights as the Altima passed. That was enough. He radioed his position and activated his light bar. He didn't run the plates until after the vehicle had already stopped. When the registration came back to Enterprise Rent-A-Car, he felt vindicated. Rental car. Out-of-town driver. Black male behind the wheel. In his mind, the story was already written. What Crenshaw didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this particular black male had spent 16 years learning exactly how to destroy enemies who believed they were untouchable. Kendrick Davenport had dismantled terrorist networks, exposed corrupt warlords, and gathered evidence under conditions that would make a federal prosecutor weep with envy. Wade Crenshaw thought he was conducting a routine traffic stop. He was walking into the most sophisticated ambush of his life. The department had protected men like Crenshaw for generations. His grandfather had been protected. His father had been protected. He expected the same treatment, the same invisible shield that made certain officers untouchable in certain jurisdictions. He expected this stop to end like every other one, with a black man humiliated, a report filed, and a complaint that went nowhere. But Kendrick Davenport's phone calls reached offices that Wade Crenshaw didn't even know existed. His former teammates included a JAG officer who had prosecuted war criminals, a congressman's son who still owed Kendrick his life from a rooftop in Mosul, a military intelligence analyst who had spent her entire career learning how to expose exactly the kind of corruption that let men like Crenshaw thrive. The sergeant believed his authority was absolute. He believed his badge made him untouchable. He believed that a decorated Navy SEAL would fold under pressure the same way every other black man he'd stopped had folded. He was about to learn the difference between a civilian who had never been trained to fight and a warrior who had spent 16 years learning exactly when not to. The booking room door slammed open, and Sergeant Dolores Vance stopped dead in her tracks. 23 years on the Ridgewood Police Force, 13 years as booking supervisor. She had processed thousands of arrests, seen every kind of criminal walk through those doors, and developed an instinct for when something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The man sitting in handcuffs wore a Navy dress uniform covered in ribbons and medals. His lip was split and swelling. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Blood had dried on the side of his face, but his posture was straight, his breathing was controlled, and his eyes held the kind of calm that only came from training most people couldn't imagine. "Who processed this arrest?" Dolores asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The young deputy at the desk looked up nervously. Sergeant Crenshaw brought him in about 20 minutes ago, said he was impersonating a military officer. Dolores walked slowly toward the holding bench. Her eyes moved across the uniform, cataloging details. The ribbons weren't costume pieces. They were positioned correctly, earned correctly, real. The bronze star sat exactly where it should. The Purple Heart ribbon showed the proper configuration, and above all of it, pinned to his chest with the precision of a man who understood what it represented, was a golden trident. She felt her stomach drop. "Son," she said quietly, "what's your name and rank?" "Chief Petty Officer Kendrick Davenport, United States Navy. SEAL Team 4, Service Number 472. "Stop." Dolores held up her hand. She turned to the deputy with an expression that made him shrink backward. "Get me a phone, now, and find out where Wade Crenshaw is." The next 45 minutes would become the most documented internal crisis in Ridgewood Police Department history. Dolores Vance personally dialed Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. She read Kendrick's service number to a duty officer who put her on hold for exactly 90 seconds before coming back on the line with a voice that had gone cold. "Ma'am, I need you to confirm the current status of Chief Petty Officer Davenport. He's in our holding facility. He was arrested approximately 1 hour ago on suspicion of..." "On suspicion of what?" Dolores closed her eyes. "Impersonating a military officer." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough to feel like a verdict. When the duty officer spoke again, every word carried the weight of an institution that did not take kindly to having its people mistreated. Chief Petty Officer Kendrick Davenport is one of the most decorated operators in naval special warfare history. He has completed 11 combat deployments. He holds a Bronze Star with Valor and 2 Purple Hearts. He is currently on terminal leave pending retirement after 16 years of service. I am now required to notify his commanding officer, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and the Pentagon's Office of the Inspector General. I suggest you release him immediately and pray that your department has a very good explanation for what happened tonight. The line went dead. Within 2 hours, the situation had escalated beyond anything Wade Crenshaw could have imagined. NCIS dispatched agents from their Atlanta field office. Kendrick's commanding officer at Little Creek made 3 phone calls, one to JAG Corps, one to the base legal office, and one to a number that didn't appear in any official directory. The Pentagon's Inspector General opened a preliminary inquiry before midnight. Sheriff Raymond Tutt arrived at the station at 1:30 in the morning, still wearing the golf shirt he'd had on at his brother-in-law's birthday party. His face was the color of old newspaper. He spoke to Kendrick personally, offered an apology that sounded rehearsed, and dropped all charges before the sun came up. But Kendrick didn't want an apology. He wanted something much more valuable. He wanted precedent. His network activated within 72 hours of his release. Lieutenant Commander Royce Thibodeau, a former teammate who now served as a JAG prosecutor, flew in from Virginia to review the case files. A Georgia State Representative, Calvin Merriweather, whose son had served alongside Kendrick in Afghanistan and came home alive because of decisions Kendrick made under fire, made phone calls to people who made phone calls to other people. Petty Officer First Class Denise Okafor, a military intelligence analyst who had spent her career learning how to expose corruption, began pulling every document, every complaint, every piece of buried evidence connected to Wade Crenshaw's career. The federal civil rights lawsuit was filed on October 17th, exactly 3 days after the arrest. The complaint named Sergeant Wade Crenshaw individually and the city of Ridgewood as a co-defendant. It cited violation of constitutional rights under color of law, excessive force, false arrest, and a pattern of discriminatory policing that the department had enabled for years. But the real weapon wasn't the lawsuit. It was the footage. Kendrick's combat camera had recorded everything. His attorneys obtained Crenshaw's body camera footage through Discovery. When the 2 recordings were synchronized and played side by side, they told a story so damning that the city's insurance attorneys reportedly watched it once and immediately began calculating settlement figures. The footage showed Kendrick's complete compliance. It showed his hands visible at all times. It showed him calmly identifying himself, requesting verification, following every instruction. And it showed Wade Crenshaw ignoring all of it. It showed the unnecessary force. It showed the takedown. It showed the knee pressed into Kendrick's spine while his shoulder separated from its socket. And it captured the words Crenshaw whispered during the arrest, the words he thought no one would ever hear, the words that would eventually play in a federal courtroom and make jurors cover their mouths in disbelief. You people think you can wear a uniform, and that makes you something. You ain't nothing. You'll always be nothing. The city offered $400,000 to settle quietly 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Kendrick's attorney, a woman named Sherelle Fontaine, who had built her career on police misconduct cases, responded with 3 words. See you in court. If you were in Kendrick's position, would you have taken the $400,000, or would you have fought for more? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to hear what you would have done. Wade Crenshaw had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. His grandfather had been untouchable. His father had been untouchable. The system had always protected men who wore the badge and understood the unwritten rules. But Kendrick Davenport had spent 16 years learning exactly how to dismantle enemies who believed they couldn't be beaten. He had toppled warlords. He had exposed terrorist networks. He had gathered evidence under conditions that would make federal prosecutors weep with admiration. Wade Crenshaw wasn't a warlord. He wasn't a terrorist. He was a small man with a badge and a family history of cruelty who had finally picked the wrong target. And Kendrick was just getting started. The federal courtroom in Atlanta fell silent as the footage began to play. Then 12 jurors leaned forward in their seats. Judge Harriet Clemens watched from the bench with an expression that revealed nothing. In the gallery, Moselle Davenport sat in a wheelchair, not fully understanding where she was or why, but knowing her grandson needed her there. Kendrick sat at the plaintiff's table in his dress uniform, every medal polished, every ribbon perfectly aligned. Across the aisle, Wade Crenshaw sat in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, his attorney shuffling papers nervously beside him. The video played for 11 minutes. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sounds were Crenshaw's voice barking commands, Kendrick's calm responses, and the sickening crack of a body being slammed against metal and asphalt. When Crenshaw's whispered words played through the courtroom speakers, a woman in the jury box gasped audibly. Another juror shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. The forewoman, a retired school principal named Gwendolyn Hebert, wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. Crenshaw's defense attorney argued standard procedure. He argued officer safety. He argued that his client had no way of knowing the uniform was legitimate, that caution was reasonable, that the force used was proportional to the perceived threat. The words sounded hollow, even as he spoke them. Everyone in that courtroom had watched the footage. Everyone had heard what Wade Crenshaw really believed about men who looked like Kendrick Davenport. Kendrick's testimony lasted 4 hours. He spoke about his training. He spoke about his service. He spoke about holding dying teammates in his arms and promising their families he would carry their memory with honor. His voice never broke. His composure never cracked. He answered every question with the precision of a man who had briefed generals and testified before military tribunals. When Cherelle Fontaine asked him what he felt during the arrest, Kendrick paused for the first time. I felt like everything I'd done didn't matter. 16 years of service, 11 deployments, friends I buried, wounds I carry. None of it mattered to that man. He looked at me and saw exactly what he wanted to see, and I realized that uniform couldn't protect me. Those medals couldn't protect me. Nothing could protect me from someone who had already decided what I was. The character witnesses came next. Teammates who had served beside Kendrick in combat, commanding officers who described him as one of the finest operators they had ever known. And then Moselle, wheeled to the witness stand by a court officer, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "That's my grandbaby," she said, pointing at Kendrick with a crooked finger. "I raised him. I told him to protect people, not destroy them. And that's what he did. That's what he always did." But the testimony that sealed Wade Crenshaw's fate came from someone no one expected. During discovery, Kendrick's legal team had uncovered a second victim from the same night. Malik Sumter was 19 years old, a sophomore at Georgia State University, stopped by Crenshaw on Old Ridgewood Highway approximately 30 minutes before Kendrick. But Malik had been pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. He had been ordered out of his car, patted down aggressively, and released without charges or explanation. Malik testified for 45 minutes. He described the fear. He described Crenshaw's tone. He described the words the officer used, words that matched Kendrick's account almost exactly. When he finished, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a mistake. This was how Wade Crenshaw operated. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Wade Crenshaw's badge was revoked permanently. His pension was forfeited. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison and added a statement that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. This defendant believed his authority was absolute. He believed his badge placed him above the citizens he swore to protect. He believed he could abuse that authority without consequence because he had done so for years without facing any. Today, this court reminds him and every officer watching that the badge is not a license for cruelty. It is a responsibility, and when that responsibility is betrayed, justice will follow. The city of Ridgewood paid $1.2 million in damages. The settlement included mandatory reforms to the police department's internal affairs procedures, implicit bias training for all officers, and the creation of an independent civilian review board. Kendrick stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, still wearing his uniform, reporters shouting questions from every direction. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. I didn't want this," he said quietly. "I just wanted to go home and see my grandmother. I wanted to sit on her porch and drink sweet tea and rest. That's all I wanted. But when someone attacks you for no reason except what you look like, you have two choices. You can accept it, or you can fight back. I've never been good at accepting things I know are wrong. 3 weeks later, Kendrick finally got what he wanted. He sat on Moselle's porch in Ridgewood, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand, watching the Georgia sunset paint the sky orange and purple. His grandmother rocked beside him in her chair, humming a hymn she'd sung to him when he was a baby. She didn't fully understand what had happened. Some days she called him by his father's name. Some days she didn't recognize him at all. But today she knew. Today, she reached over and patted his hand with those geography map fingers, and she smiled. You did good, baby. Just like I told you. You showed him what you decided to be. Kendrick closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 16 years. The settlement money didn't stay in his bank account for long. 6 months after the verdict, Kendrick established the Tavian Wright Foundation, named after the best friend he'd lost on those Ninth Ward streets when they were just kids. The foundation provides legal defense for victims of police misconduct who can't afford attorneys. It pays for counseling. It funds scholarships for young people trying to escape the same neighborhoods Kendrick escaped. He does the work quietly, without cameras, without recognition. When reporters call asking for interviews, he declines. When documentary filmmakers reach out, he says no. He didn't fight Wade Crenshaw to become famous. He fought because it was right. Some nights he still wakes up from dreams about Afghanistan, about Syria, about teammates who didn't come home. Some mornings, his shoulder aches where Crenshaw dislocated it, a reminder that will never fully fade. But he gets up anyway. He checks on Moselle. He makes her breakfast. He sits on the porch and watches the sun rise over a country he gave 16 years of his life to protect. Chief Petty Officer Kendrick Davenport survived 11 deployments. He survived the Ninth Ward. He survived Wade Crenshaw. But he'll tell you the hardest thing he ever did was sit on that porch, hold his grandmother's hand, and finally let himself rest. The moral of this story is simple but worth remembering. No uniform can protect you from prejudice. No medal can shield you from hate. But courage, preparation, and the refusal to accept injustice can move mountains that seemed permanent. Kendrick didn't win because he was stronger than Wade Crenshaw. He won because he was smarter, more patient, and more committed to justice than his enemy was committed to cruelty. The system protected men like Crenshaw for generations. It took one man who refused to be silent to begin tearing that protection down. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that justice is possible even when the system fails, subscribe now and turn on notifications. More stories like this one are coming. Stories of courage, stories of survival, stories of ordinary people who refuse to accept extraordinary injustice. Don't miss them. And before you go, drop a comment below. Tell us what you think. Share your own experience if you have one. Your words might inspire someone else who needs to hear them tonight. This community grows stronger when we lift each other up. Until next time.